Hello, my name is Dr. Jacqueline Redistricting, and I'm with DTP-Leadership Group. And this is Hot Topic Bold Talk. What we're going to do today is talk about when the dam breaks, the quiet Republican revolt against Trump's power grabs. Now, I'm aware that President Trump gave a speech, but the honest truth is it doesn't matter what he said. If you've been paying any attention for the last decade, you already know the pattern. He performs, he distracts, he attacks, he floods the zone with claims that can't all be checked in real time. And while people argue about the words, the power move keeps happening. So he plans the way he does to gain more power. And that's what happens. Now, we're not going to waste time with whatever his speech was about, because we're going to treat the speech as background noise, because that's what it is. And we need to look at really what is happening, where the real story lies. And even though he's ended up being a billionaire after being president and getting all kinds of advantages, he thinks that way. So he thinks he can buy off people and do other things. But in the behavior that he does, we never see the real story. So that's what we're going to be looking for. Because we can look for the real story in the behavior of elected officials, the fractions inside the Republican Party, the weakening of the Congress as a co-equal branch, since it no longer is. He's gaining more and more power. And the redistricting war that keeps going on, and the economy that households feel in their bones, and the growing coalition of unlikely Americans who are refusing to cooperate with the authoritarian outreach. So this episode is built to help you in two ways. You're going to understand what is really happening beneath the drama, and I'm going to give you some very practical language, calm, clear, usable language for conversations with people who throw out mega lines if they were facts. I want you to be calm, clear, and you have usable language because we don't want to argue anymore. We want to maintain it so we can have discussions and possibly put out information that they've never heard before. Many of us have friends. I do. Coworkers, neighbors, or even family members who are stuck in a loop. Not necessarily because they're evil. They're not. Often because they're overwhelmed, they're misinformed, they're lonely. The algorithm they've been fed gets them to thinking a certain way, or they're frightened. And so Trump often tells a story that feels simple and it appears emotionally satisfying for all those things. But here's the truth. Mega talking points collapse when you ask for specifics, when you bring back to values that you may have and they may have, and when you see how the real world examples give really clear messages that they need to hear. And the most important thing or twist is some Republicans are starting to say the quiet part out loud. Even Marjorie Taylor Greene, who once functioned as an American megaphone for Trumpism, has been publicly breaking with him. Indiana Republicans, who I respect highly, delivered a rare rebuke to his redistricting pressure campaign. Former and exiting senators are describing the Senate as broken, retreated, and abdication. And even people in business, faith leaders, and the military community, those pillars that authoritarian movements depend on, are showing signs of resistance. That's not a fantasy. It is the reporting that we see if you read enough news and so forth. It's in their interviews. It's in the facts on the ground. So I want to walk you through those things because I think it's so important. Here's why Trump's speech does not matter. When a leader lies frequently, the content of their speech becomes less important than the function of that speech. If we were seeing a functioning Democratic leader, they use speeches to explain policy choices or to persuade with evidence of what they see as important or to invite accountability and to clarify what the government is about to do. A demagogue like Trump uses speeches to dominate attention, to create enemies, to claim credit where he has no credit, to deny responsibility, which he does all the time, and to reframe reality so supporters distrust all external information that doesn't come from him or his sources of news. In that contrast, the speech is not communication, it's control. So instead of debating what happened in his performance, we're going to ask better questions. What is happening inside the party that used to operate like a disciplined bloc around Trump? Where is Congress still checking him and where is it failing? How are the state level Republicans responding when the White House tries to commandeer their sovereignty? You can see what happened in LA. You can see what happened in Chicago. They're speaking out. What are the economic warning signs Americans are living through right now? And what does it mean when a pillar of support starts to wobble? These are questions that really matter because democracy doesn't usually end with a single dramatic moment. It erodes through normal abuse, institutional surrender, and public exhaustion. That's why today's theme in this podcast is ignore the performance, track the fractions, track the institutions that are now speaking out, track the incentives. What's happening where people are going to be able to say, no, wait a minute, I don't want to support him because here are the things that I don't like. Now, I want to go to Green's story. She calls herself a bellwether or a warning. It happened in the Washington Post, reporting it in their 5-minute fix. It draws from Victoria Crow's reporting about how Republicans on Capitol Hill are thinking about Trump right now. Marjorie Taylor Greene went on CNN and said some extraordinary things, that Trump has real problems inside the Republican Party, that he's out of touch on affordability, and that the dam is breaking. She even said she doesn't see Republicans winning the midterm right now. Now, pause for a moment. This isn't Adam Schiff saying Trump is out of touch. This isn't AOC saying this. This is not a Democratic strategist saying this. This is Marjorie Taylor Greene, someone who carved out a high-profile role as one of Trump's most vocal allies. First as a MAGA, then as America First. When she calls it, you're supposed to listen, not because she's morally reliable, but because she is politically tuned to the MAGA base. Greene describes herself as a bellwether. She's essentially saying, I've been inside the algorithm. I know the base. I know what they tolerate, and I'm telling you the mood is shifting. She gives examples. The backlash to Trump's comments around the death of Rob Reiner. House Republican voting with Democrats to overturn an executive order on collective bargaining. Indiana Republicans rejecting Trump's redistricting push. She called Trump's comments about the director's death below the office, classless, and wrong. Most importantly, Green hammered a core point the Democrats sometimes fail to communicate effectively. Affordability is not a culture war issue, it is a survival issue for the base of her constituents. And many of us, or 70% of us in the United States, are screaming about this. She describes affordability as a crisis and said Trump hasn't tackled it. She criticized the idea of brushing off inflation and hardship as a hoax and asked for sympathy for Americans. So now you don't have to like Green. I don't agree with her all the time, but some of the things she's saying now really make sense to me. The bond between Trump and part of his base is transactional. It's not spiritual. Trump is powerful because he's convinced people he can hurt their enemies and make life feel stable. When life feels less stable and he seems cruel and out of touch, he starts losing the emotional contact. That's why Green matters here. She is a symptom of what's going on. The moment Trump's coalition began to show visible splits, more splits become possible. And that's how political gravity works. Once the myth of invisibility breaks, people start acting like they've allowed to think for themselves again. Now let's look at Indiana, the red state that rebuffed, that should scare Trump world. If you want a case of performance versus reality, Indiana's is it. Their reality. Trump and his allies pushed for mid-decade redistricting, an aggressive move to redraw congressional lines before the 2026 midterms to protect the Republican House majority. In other states, Republicans have complied. In Indiana, something else happened. It was very different. Indiana Republicans said no. The Washington Post has an article, Democracy in America. It's a story that details how Indiana's GOP state senators rejected Trump's pressure campaign. Not a narrow squeak, a real rejection. A deep red state, a Republican-controlled chamber, and yet 21 Republicans joined all the Democrats to defeat the map. And it wasn't just policy disagreement. The reporting describes intimidation, political and physical, including swatting and hoax police reports aimed at lawmakers' homes. Let that sink in for a moment. When an American president pressures a state to manipulate its electoral maps mid-decade, and lawmakers resisting and having to face intimidation tactics that resemble political harassment, we are no longer in normal politics. And we haven't been for a long time, ever since Trump got into office. We're in a struggle over whether elections are instruments of representation of American voters or instruments of control. Indiana Republicans offer a phrase that should become famous in all states. Hoosiers are very independent. Hoosiers are very independent. They didn't want Washington to tell them what to do. They didn't want to be bullied. They didn't want to inflame division in their state. They didn't want the noise. They wanted to focus on cost of living, health care, and taxes, real issues. And what did Trump do? He attacked them. He threatened primary challenges like he did Green. He insulted their leadership on social media. This mattered for a number of reasons. Authoritarian movements require compliance from local institutions. They need state officials, party leaders, election administrators, business donors, and cultural figures to cooperate. Indiana showed that cooperation is not guaranteed. And once one red state Republican legislation publicly refuses a Trump command, it creates permission to others to do the same. So the New York Times said, we have 6 things that we can take away from Indiana as a sign that Trump's iron grip has slipped, likely to reverberate nationally. So let's look at some of the key things. More Republicans daring to cross him on issues like the Epstein files, Venezuela's military action, tariffs, healthcare, and redistricting. Warnings that scorched earth gerrymandering creates risk for the party because safe margins may not be safe in a shifting electorate. And the looming threat of Supreme Court decisions that could scramble maps again through the Voting Rights Act being weakened by the Supreme Court, which is a Trump court. This is crucial to know. Redistricting fights are not process stories. They are democratic stories. They determine whose votes count, whose communities stay intact, and whether politicians choose voters instead of voters choosing politicians. So when MAGA friends say both sides use gerrymandering, you can say, yes, both sides have played hardball. But this moment is about something very different and distinct. Mid-decade redistricting driven by the president's pressure, paired with threats, intimidation, and a national strategy to lock in minority rule, that's not ordinary. That's acceleration of control. And India Republicans just told Trump, not here. No, you're not going to do it here. And then I want to go to an article that talks about the Senate is broken, retreated, it's abdicated. And what does it really reveal? So I'm turning to the New York Times interview by Lula Garcia Navarro, and it featured Jeff Flake, Joe Manchin, and Tina Smith. This isn't pundit talk. This is lawmakers, some out, some leaving, talking candidly about the state of the Senate and the broader health of democracy. Garcia Navarro, asked them to describe the Senate in one word. Tina Smith said broken. Jeff Flake said retreat. Joe Manchin said abdication. And when he asked they want to call them cowards, Manchin basically said, you said it. Now here's the important part. They argue the Senate is surrendering Article 1 authority, its constitutional role as the president grabs more power and as lawmakers fear Trump's retribution. Flake points out that every president pushes limits with executive orders, but Trump is doing it massively, which is why the Senate needs to stand up. Manchin says he describes a lost culture of relationship building and compromise that existed in the Senate. The idea that after election you could still talk, learn, and work together for the benefit of the American people. They also discuss the incentive structure that makes resistance hard. The threat of primary challenges, the fear of angry tweets that Trump does, the sense that guilt by conversation now replaces guilt by association. This is not lamentation, it's analysis. It tells us something that matters for your conversations. MAGA is not just a set of beliefs, it is a discipline system. It punishes dissenters. It demands submission. It teaches people that when speaking with the other side is betrayal. And when a movement reaches that point, it becomes less about policy and more about identity enforcement. And I love that term, identity enforcement, because it finally came to me what has really been going on. Smith adds a crucial insight. He says, behind the scenes, many Republicans say they don't like what's happening, but they keep waiting for the right moment to act while Senate power gushes out of the Capitol. That phrase, gushing out, it's vivid. It implies that power is leaving quickly and maybe irreversibly if the institution doesn't fight for it. They debate the filibuster, reform versus preservation, leadership failures, and the idea that Americans want big changes because the status quo isn't working. They want affordable care, child care, paid leave, wages, and health care reform. And here's a major warning embedded in their conversation. When people feel the system doesn't respond to their needs, they become vulnerable to leaders who promise domination rather than governance. That's the authoritarian bargain. Give me power and I'll fix it. But if the fix is really revenge, corruption, and power hoarding, the suffering remains and the scapegoating accelerates. So let's look at the economy. When affordability stops being an abstract, let's connect it with the political fractures to the economic reality. The New York Times report, Rebecca Davis and O'Brien, describes a labor market warning sign. Unemployment rising to 4.6%, the highest in 4 years, after delayed data due to a government shutdown. Employees added 64,000 jobs in November. Federal government job losses were significant. Wages growth slowed. Manufacturing shed jobs, and a broader measure of labor slack rose to 8.7%. Tragically, Black unemployment rose sharply to 8.3%. Whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, these are not culture war numbers. These are life numbers. They are rent numbers. They are grocery numbers. They are my cousin can't afford anything because they can't find a job now. And that's exactly why Green's point about empathy really matters. When MAGA supporters say Trump is saving the economy, the question isn't whether the stock market had a good day. The questions are the following. Are wages keeping up? Are jobs stable? Which they're not, but they're good questions to ask the person who's making this comment. You can also ask, are full-time jobs available? Are manufacturing jobs returning or still disappearing? Are households feeling relieved? Or are they in anxiety, which in many are today? Are federal policies causing chaos and layoffs? Now, add the political context discussed in the Atlantic. If lawmakers know little major legislation will pass beyond must pass bills, and if Trump's popularity is low and falling, then they have fewer incentives to cling to him. If he can still wreck them in a primary but can't save them in a general, they start recalculating. That is how coalitions shift, not through moral awakening alone, but through incentives meeting reality. Now, the Atlantic has a great article, A Dawning Realization Trump is a Lame Duck, and he's facing that gravity. David Graham with the Atlantic Pieces lays out the theme that Trump is entering a lame duck era, not because he's weak in the formal sense, but because political gravity eventually applies to everyone. The piece ties together, please hear it, Indiana defiance, the Epstein file dispute, and Green's break, the Senate's cold shoulder on killing the filibuster, the dissatisfaction about the military actions and questions of legality and humanity, and signs of electoral problems and troubles for Republicans. A key idea here is political morality. Even the most durable leader starts losing control as the end approaches, especially if scandals pile up, of effectiveness declines, or the public mood turns. Even if Trump remains exceptionally powerful, and he is, cracks in compliance are meaningful because authoritarian power depends on the belief that resistance is futile. Once people see resistance working, even in small ways, an Indiana vote, a public break, a budget withheld, a refusal to cooperate, the myth weakens. And when the myth weakens, more people test the boundaries of independence. Now, ultimately, unlikely alliances can occur, and the pillars of support change. Austin Weatherford with Bright America pieces together and pulls through some of the concepts around what political scientists use to understand how authoritarian movements succeed or fail. It depends on the pillars of support. An overall administration doesn't run on a single leader alone. It requires cooperation from business leaders and donors, from faith institutions and moral authorities, from military and law enforcement communities, and from civil servants and bureaucrats. It also requires cultural platforms and media ecosystems. When pillars hold, overreach accelerates, and that's what's been happening to us. When pillars wobble, overreach slows down, and that's what we need to be looking at. The Bright America piece gives examples of resistance and signals of resistance. Ranchers criticizing plans to import Argentina beef as a betrayal. Catholic bishops opposing the indiscriminate mass deportation and dehumanizing rhetoric. Veterans and military families criticizing political-sized deployments. They're saying these are political deployments. They're not for the right reasons. Corporate leaders avoiding actions that appear like buying favors. And shareholders pressure and staff push back against the political decisions. Then it names two tactics of resistance: breaking, refusal to comply. So we have resignations, non-cooperation, refusing to share sensitive records. Binding, behind the scene persuasion that pulls insiders away from unconstitutional orders. This matters for you with your conversation, and it can reframe hope. Hope is not just winning the next election. Hope is also seeing people refuse unlawful orders, institutions holding boundaries, communities choosing principles over fear, and widening coalition that makes it harder for overreach to function. And the coalition is not limited to Democrats. That is it's a strategy that's open to all of us in the moment. So how do we talk to our MAGA friends without losing our minds? Let's be practical about it. My goal is not to destroy them, and that doesn't need to be your goal. Your goal and mine is to disrupt the loop they're in. Shift the conversation from slogans to specifics. Anchor to shared values. Reduce the emotional temperature and plant questions they can't unhear and usually cannot answer. The core rule is the following: never argue with a slogan. Ask for the receipt. A slogan is designed to be repeated. A receipt requires thinking. So your main tools are the following: stay calm and curious. Request for specific things where they got things or where they heard this. And base it on values that both of you possibly hold. There's a 3-step conversation framework that I know works. The first step is mirror. Show you've heard them. Give them recognition. Tell them what you've heard. The next step is narrow. Ask for specifics because they don't have them. Or references. And the third step is re-anchor. Focus on shared values, real examples, because examples are the thing that will make the greatest points. Let's say a statement. Trump tells it like it is. I can say, or you can say, as we mirror, you seem to like that he sounds like he's direct. Narrowing becomes, what specific policy changes are you thinking of that helped your family? Now we're shifting into a whole nother arena and re-anchoring. Because I'm less focused on the performance and more focused on the outcomes, like affordability, jobs, and whether Congress still checks the president, let's talk about those things. This avoids a fight and forces substantive discussions. So remember, mirror, narrow, and then re-anchor. Now, mega statements and calm, usable responses are what we want. So now I'm going to talk about mega style lines and the responses that you can build so you can provide articles and many other things so they can be a different conversation. Republican fractures, Senate abdication, Indiana Rebuke, economic warning signs, and broad-based resistance can be very helpful tools and subjects that you need to know a lot about. For an example, MAGA may say, Trump won, people want this. Our response can be, winning an election doesn't mean that they get a blank check. Our system is built on checks and balances for a reason. Even former Republican senator like Jeff Flagg says Congress has been retreating from its Article 1 role, and that's dangerous no matter who the president is. MAGA, Republicans are united, it's just the media. Response, if that were true, Indiana Republicans wouldn't have publicly rejected Trump's redistricting pressure campaign in a deep red state. And even Marjorie Taylor Greene is warning that the dam is breaking inside the party. MAGA comment, it's fine for Trump to pressure states. Politics is politics. Our response could be, states have always redistricted, but not in mid-decade map changes pushed by a president to lock in House control, paired with threats and intimidation, crosses into a different category. Indiana Republicans said Hoosiers are very independent and refuse to be bullied. That should concern anyone who cares about fair representation. So what do you think about fair representation? MAGA, the Senate's useless. Anyway, who cares? Response, agreement that it's failing and that the problem, Tina Smith called it broken. Manchin said there's an abdication. And Flagg said they've retreated. If the Senate gives up its constitutional role, the presidency becomes too powerful. That's how democratic systems slide and fail. Another MAGA comment. Trump is fixing the economy. You just hate him. A response to that is, I'm not talking about vibes. I'm talking about affordability and jobs. The latest data shows unemployment rising and wage growth slowing. People are also working part-time jobs when they want full-time jobs. If policies are working, households should feel relief, especially people most vulnerable to the layoffs, and that's not happening. MAGA, Democrats are the real threat to democracy. Our response, I'll criticize anyone who undermines democratic rules. But right now we have a president pushing states to change maps mid-decade to protect political power, and lawmakers describing Congress as surrendering its authority. That's not a left-right issue. That's a system issue that we need to talk about. MAGA comment. You can't trust any of the media. Our response, then trust patterns and cross confirmation. When a MAGA icon like Green breaks with Trump, when Indiana Republicans vote him down, and when former senators describe the Senate surrender, we're not relying on one outlet. We're watching reality show up in multiple places. Another MAGA comment. He's tough. We need toughness. Our response, toughness isn't cruelty, and toughness isn't ignoring people's sufferings. Even Green said what she wants is empathy for Americans on affordability. Strength without empathy becomes arrogance, and arrogance in power becomes abusive, and that's what we're living through. MAGA, the end justifies the means. That's the line every democracy regrets. If you mobilize means like intimidation, threats, and power grabs, you don't just get your end, You also get a country where no one trusts elections and everyone expects retaliation. That's not stability, it's decay. MAGA, he's been treated unfairly. Every politician can say that. The real question is, does he respect limits? No. Does he accept checks and balances on his power? No. Because the consistent theme right now is from Indiana to the Senate is that he pressures people to comply and institutions are struggling to hold their boundaries. Let's look at the deeper problem. Why people stay in the MAGA loop. If we want to help people out of the loop, we have to understand what keeps them there, not to excuse it, but to be effective. People cling to MAGA narratives because they provide a simple explanation for complex problems, a community identity, an emotional outlet for anger and humiliation, and an enemy to blame. When you attack the narrative head on, you can trigger shame and defensiveness, which pushes them deeper into the community that protects them. So that's not what we want to do. So instead, let's focus on this shared values. Where do they see fairness? Or where do they appreciate dignity for human beings, or freedom, or honesty, or stability? Have questions that incite reflection and concrete examples where Trump's behavior harms people and their stated values. For an example, if someone says they care about states' rights and local control, say, oh gosh, Indiana is your example. Let me tell you about what's happened there if you haven't thought about it. If someone says they care about the Constitution, then you say the Senate's abdication and Article 1 surrender are things that you've got to realize that are happening right now. So you're caring about the Constitution of the United States, you're seeing a problem here. If someone says they care about working families, then you talk about affordability and job numbers. That's the examples you can use. If someone says they care about law and order, then you say, well, wait a minute, let's look at these intimidation tactics and threats, because that's not what I call law and order. If someone says they hate elite, then say Trump's billionaire detachment from affordability becomes your example. You're not owning them. You're showing them that their values conflicts and they have value conflicts is what's happening. That creates a cognitive dissonance. And dissonance is the doorway out. So what Republicans are doing to break with Trump actually means, and what it does. Let's be realistic. Let's be clear. Cracks are not a collapse. Trump may still maintain high approval within the party. He may still dominate primaries. He may still control media cycles. He may still use threats effectively. But cracks matter because of how quickly they can widen under the right conditions. Worsening economic pain, unpopular politics, legal and ethical slanders, electoral losses that scare incumbents, and rising public disgust with cruelty and chaos. The most important shift is not that Republicans and suddenly become Democrats. That's not what we're looking for. It's what we're looking for is some Republicans are prioritizing constituents over Trump. Some are publicly naming his behavior as wrong, and some are refusing his demands even under pressure. that open spaces for a coalition of Democrats and anti-Trump Republicans plus independents to agree on democratic basics, concepts. Elections should be fair. Districts should not be manipulated midstream to protect political power. Congress should be a real check, and political violence and intimidation must be condemned consistently. You do not need agreement on every policy issue to agree on democratic rules. In fact, that's the point. Democracy is the container that allows policy disagreements without national breakdown. So here's a resource that I want to give you. What you can say in 30 seconds. If you're in a quick conversation and need compact responses, here are some short scripts. And you know that I make my scripts available through my blog, so you can copy them. Here's a comment. I'm not doing the slogan fight script. I'm not trying to debate slogans. I'm looking at what actually happens. From Republicans that are starting to break with Trump, Indiana Republicans just rejected his redistricting push, and lawmakers are warning Congress that they are surrendering their power. That's what worries me. Here's another one, another script. Affordability and empathy is the script. Forget the drama. People are struggling. Even Marjorie Taylor Greene says affordability is a crisis and Trump is out of touch. Empathy and real economic outcomes matter more than speeches. Here's another script, the checks and balances. No president should have unchecked power. Former senators are calling the Senate broken and saying it's abdicated its responsibilities. That's dangerous, regardless of who is in power. The Indiana Principle is a great script. I actually respect what Indiana Republicans did. They said no to Washington pressure and refused mid-decade gerrymandering. That's what independence looks like. And we can have that in every state if all of us stand up. Here's an unlikely ally script. This isn't just partisan resistance. Veterans, faith leaders, and even corporate leaders are pushing back in different ways when they see abuse of power. That should tell us something. So here's what I think that Democrats and anti-Trump Republicans and independents need to do next. If the goal is to build resources and momentum for people who do not support Trump across party lines, then the strategy has to meet reality. So one, stop treating every conversation like it's a trial. And I know I've experienced that when I talk to MAGAs. But I can't do that anymore. I have to stop treating every conversation like a trial. You don't need to prove Trump is bad in a moral courtroom every day. Many people are exhausted by moralizing. Instead, let's focus on concrete harms, institutional boundaries, and real life outcomes. Two, make democracy tangible. Democracy can sound abstract. Indiana makes it tangible. Who draws the lines? Why now? Who benefits? What intimidation occurred? What does fair representation mean in your neighbor's life? Three, build a big tent without humiliating defectors. If people fear shame, they stay loyal to the group that won't shame them. Your message can be, you don't have to agree with me on everything. If you're ready to defend fair elections, checks and balances, and basic decency, we can work together. Four, The institutional abuse to kitchen table reality is how we can move. When Congress abdicates power, presidents govern through chaos. Chaos hits markets, jobs, prices, public services, and community stability. That's not theory. That's lived experiences. Number 5, keep track of the cracks and name them. Cracks become patterns when you name them. Green's break, Indiana's rebuke, sentence warnings of members that have been senators. Public discomfort with overreach, broad-based non-cooperation. Not as propaganda, it's as observations. So I want to close this podcast by saying, I hope you will run a copy of my blog and keep it with you and practice over and over again some of the things I've given you. I'm going to have to read a bunch of times too to keep myself in line. I'll admit that. Here's what I want you to watch over the next few months. More state-level refusals of Trump's pressure campaigns, especially around election rules and districting. More Republicans signaling fear of midterm losses, which changes incentives much faster. Whether the Senate reasserts power on tariffs, war powers, and oversight, or keeps surrendering. Economic indicators that affect household confidence, unemployment, wage growth, part-time for full-time jobs, manufacturing jobs. The behavior of the pillars of support. Look at the businesses, the faith groups, the military communities, and the civil servants, because authoritarianism cannot function without them. And here's the heart of my message today. Trump's speech is theater. The real story is whether Americans in both parties decide that the democracy rules are bigger than one man. Indiana just gave us an answer. Some Republicans are giving us answers. Some former senators are giving us answers. And you in your conversations can be part of that shift, not by screaming louder, but by speaking clearer. Keep yourself calm. Ask for specifics and anchor in values and tell the truth. That's how the loop breaks. Thank you so much for listening. And I hope you'll listen to it again or read my podcast, copy it. And of course, you're going to have all my references that I used today. Thank you very much.